Um,
David, oh, can I ask one question? So there's a Steve in the attendees list. Steve, is that Steve Solorio? Steve, whoever Steve is, you can unmute yourself and speak to say you're Steve Solorio or not Steve Solorio.
No, I'm not Steve.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Steve, but not the one you're looking for.
Okay, great, thank you. Just wanted to check.
Okay.
okay. All right. Well, let me thank staff for pulling this together, and also Teresa. What has happened, as you all know, since the COVID-19 emergency, we obviously had to postpone our meetings. And with the continued restrictions, though, Teresa and I have continued to meet with staff to try and figure out what, if any, progress we can still make with the task force. And so even though we've been able to do a lot of the council referral and covered a lot of ground, there's still a lot of work that remains to be done. And so we had discussions about, well, what are some of the options that we could do to allow us to continue to make progress on this? And let me just say, we don't have clear answers on all of that yet, but one of the things that staff suggested, which was, let's give this a try. Let's give Zoom a try. Let's try a virtual meeting. This is going to be a first, obviously for us. It's probably a first for the city in that, although the city's been having lots of Zoom meetings, we've got a gigantic task force, and I don't think there's been a group of people this big who've tried to do a Zoom meeting. Obviously, we're best in person. It's best to work this way, but we wanted to try and give this a try. And so as a test, we didn't want to run a full-fledged, 2-hour, 3-hour plus meeting as they've been going over 3 hours. We thought, why not just try a single issue and test this format out? We expect there's going to be bugs with many people who are involved tonight, but we thought, well, let's try one issue for discussion and see how it goes. So we're going to give that a try. We'll go into some of the details of the mechanics of how the meeting's going to go in just a minute. But before I do that, I understand, Rosalind, you would like to make a statement in terms of, some of the very significant and serious issues that have been confronting the city and the nation over these last few weeks.
Great, thank you, David and Teresa. First, it's good to see all of you this evening. We haven't convened since February, so I'm glad that we're able to do this by Zoom this evening. So before we did get started in the work that we have before us tonight, I did just want to take a moment really just to acknowledge all that I will say we as a city has been through these last 3+ months. The weeks just seem to keep going on and on and on. Obviously, 3 months ago, we found ourselves responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And actually, our city was just clearly focused on saving lives, right? We were focused on saving lives, keeping people safe, and then responding to the most vulnerable of our population. And that work clearly continues. And just acknowledging that all of us, right, we had to get used to a new way of living, a new way of working, a new way of schooling for some of us. And so I just think it's very important that first we just acknowledge what we have been through together and continuing to go through together as a community. And then now I think we also, clearly we are in a moment where we find ourselves, witnessing very disturbing acts. And it is heart-wrenching, just absolutely heart-wrenching, witnessing Black people being murdered, some by police, and obviously the outcry from our communities, from our cities across the country, really across the globe, about the issue of systemic racism and racial inequities. And I've been saying that I feel like that we as a San Jose community, I think we're clearly in a time of both reckoning, so a time of acknowledgement and accountability, and making some very significant changes and moving forward. And I think we're also in a time of reconciliation. And I'm forever optimist and believe that out of situations like these, we can become a better community and learn and grow together and heal a lot of wounds, right? Heal wounds in individual hearts and heal wounds in our community, and really come out of all of this together being a better community. And so I think the work really of the task force, I think that you now have an awesome opportunity, right, as you deliberate policy changes and new policies, to really think about the people in our community who are going to be impacted by those policies. So, you know, as an urban planner, as a profession, like our own profession is coming to grips with how we have perpetrated racism due to planning and zoning laws. So I think it's now an opportunity now to think about and make sure that we're leading people. And so I just encourage all of us as we continue to work together to think about how these policies really do impact the people that we all get to work with and grow with and be with. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the co-chairs. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosalind. So our main topic, new topic for discussion tonight is commercial requirements for affordable housing, and the policy we're going to talk about tonight doesn't pertain to just urban villages, but throughout the city. And staff will be presenting on that momentarily. On the agenda, our next item is a review of the meeting synopsis from way back in February, if anybody remembers that time when we weren't sheltering in place. Are there any corrections or additions anyone wants to make to the meeting synopsis? You're gonna have to raise your hand, and I'm looking at the list here. Okay, Harvey's got a hand up. It's gonna be Harvey first, and then after Harvey, Juan Estrada.
So I looked at these minutes, and I remember from that meeting that after the public comment period, because it was so late and so many people had left, and that a second issue, that the map of the opportunity housing didn't scale up in a way that people could see whether their homes would be affected or not, that I asked two things. One, that the staff provide us with a scalable map and that we could distribute to the public or have on the website that would be accessible to the public. And two, that because there was limited public participation, that when we came back, that we would open it up to further public comment.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Harvey. Juan, did you have any additions or corrections?
I may be mistaken, but when I look at the agenda to click on the link for the synopsis, I think I'm not taken to one. And so I may have overlooked a different link or a different document, but I couldn't find it. I will likely abstain not being able to review it.
Okay. Anyone else have any comments or corrections on the synopsis? Raise your hand, just click the icon on the participant list there. And I'm seeing Michelle. Yasni, did you intend to click your hand, raise your hand?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I had the same trouble with the synopsis. When I clicked on the link, it wasn't a link, it was just an agenda. And so I never read the minutes either, so I will also abstain.
All right. Let's see, Bob Levy? Robert? You have to
I
unmute.
experienced the
Yeah, there you
same
go.
thing. I just saw the agenda when I clicked on synopsis.
All right. Let's do this. So this is a bug. This is what we're talking about, testing things out. Let's defer, since more than just one or two people haven't been able to read it. Let's just defer approval of the synopsis. I'll just say for the record, Harvey, I do recollect you bringing up that issue at the end of the last meeting. I would just ask staff to include that in this in an amended synopsis. Okay.
And David, this is Teresa. I did just check the link. It's not working. So
All right.
thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll get that link repaired. Sorry, everyone.
Okay, so let's now go on to announcements and recap. Who from the staff's going to handle that?
I can handle that. So we have two new task force members. We have Megan Fluke from Green Foothills. She replaced Kiyomi from Greenbelt Alliance. And we have Planning Commissioner Caballero. She replaced Melanie Griswold. So congrats and welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome, both of you. Thank you for joining. I hope you don't regret it.
So next we have task force recommendations. This is just overview of agenda. And I want to remind everyone, including public attendees, when you close out of Zoom, since this is our first virtual meeting, we definitely would like for you to fill out the survey, what ways we could improve. Any comments are welcome. Let's move on. So here's the recap of task force recommendation from the February 27th meeting. So for the topic of urban villages, the task force recommended on Monterey Road, a new urban village called the Capital Caltrain Station area. And the task force also on the Story Road Employments area recommend that as an urban village. On the topic of neighborhood business districts, for residential uses in neighborhood business districts, the task force recommended to allow residential uses in 4 neighborhood business districts: Caillou Willow, Willow Glen, North 13th Street, and Japantown, the Taylor Street portion only, if these residential projects meet the following criteria. First, to replace 100% of existing commercial or industrial uses, to comply with citywide design guidelines, to adaptively reuse historic resources, and finally, to protect businesses, small businesses that are existing. Along with this, the 4 areas will be established as a growth area and will have an initial pool of 600 residential units. The task force moving forward also directed staff to develop ways to protect small businesses, to explore value capture, and to do public outreach before establishing density and heights in each of the 4 business districts. Next, we're going to talk about the task force schedule.
Can I just stop you 1 second, Keelan?
Yes.
So I want to make sure everybody knows they have the option to do this. Right now, you're referring to some slides, some PowerPoint slides, right, Keelan?
Yes.
And so some of you may still have the gallery view up where you're seeing everybody, but you're not seeing Keelan's PowerPoint slides. So if you want to follow along with the slides, Up on the top left in the gallery view, there's the icons of the different ways you can display, the gallery view. You want to go to the one that minimizes or hides the thumbnail view so you can watch Keelan's presentation. Okay? All right,
Thanks, David.
sure.
So the following are the remaining topics for the meetings from July. We anticipate July through November, if we do one topic per meeting. We're next in July on the 30th is opportunity housing for task force discussion and recommendation and to open to public comment. In August, we have Coyote Valley and shifting planned capacities. September, we have vehicles miles travel, tier 2 policies. October is Evergreen East Hills development policy. And finally, in November, we'll summarize all the recommendations and the next steps before we go to City Council. The topic for tonight's meeting is commercial requirements for policy H2.9, also known as the 1.5 acre rule. The general plan 4-year scope directed staff to explore changes to commercial requirements for affordable housing developments. So in the context of the general plan for commercial requirements that affect affordable housing projects, there are 3 policies. The first is the signature project policy, IP 5.10. Though typically signature projects are generally proposed in 100% market rate units. Next is policy IP 5.12, and then policy H2.9. So in the context of in January, when the task force passed recommendations, it was the first 2 policy. On the signature project policy, the task force recommended as part of a feasibility analysis to evaluate the reduction or elimination of commercial requirements as an incentive for affordable housing for signature projects and in all urban villages. On policy IP 5.12, which allows 100% affordable housing projects to move forward ahead of an adopted urban village plan or a growth horizon, the task force recommended removing the requirement to replace existing on-site commercial square footage. Now, because these 2 policies focus on urban village growth areas, the task force directed staff to explore flexible commercial requirements for affordable housing citywide. One of the policies staff is currently evaluating is General Plan Policy H2.9. This was part of the original item for the Housing Crisis Work Plan, item number 22. This allows 100% deed-restricted affordable housing on commercial land use designations. So here the policy is on the side, and it states, to increase the supply of affordable housing, 100% deed-restricted affordable housing developments would be allowed on sites outside of existing growth areas, on properties with mixed-use commercial or neighborhood community commercial land use designations, if the development meets the following criteria. Number 1, the site is 1.5 acre or less. Number 2, the site is vacant or underutilized. Number 3, the site has adjacent properties with a residential general plan land use transportation diagram designation on at least one side, and the development will be compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. 4, the development would not impact the viability of surrounding commercial or industrial properties or businesses. 5, the site is located within a half mile of an existing transit line. 6, the development integrates commercial uses that support the affordable housing project and or the surrounding neighborhood. And finally, 7, development on properties that contain structures that are on or are eligible for inclusion on the City of San Jose's Historic Resources Inventory should adaptively reuse these structures. Staff's recommendation is to remove criteria number 6. This removes the requirement on affordable housing projects to provide on-site commercial uses. The policy's intent is to create an exception for affordable housing, since the site's existing characteristics based on the policy criteria indicate that it is unlikely to be successful for commercial uses. Even with a commercial use designation, the site has remained vacant or underutilized. Staff also recognizes the financial challenges for affordable housing projects to incorporate commercial into their projects. Therefore, to provide further flexibility for affordable housing, staff recommends removing the commercial replacement requirement. And that concludes staff's presentation.
Okay, thanks, Keelan. So what I'd like to do is, as we've done at some of our prior meetings, is let's see if we can divide this into two parts. What I'd like to do first is, if you have a question about what's being recommended, let's deal with questions first, because then what we'll do is we'll open it to public comment. And then after the public comment period, then we'll have comments and discussions on the staff recommendation. So let's start with any questions. And I see a lot of hands. Teresa, do you want to go first?
Sure. Staff, can you go back 2 slides? So number 4, how does the city define viability? I worry that that is an open-ended opportunity for commercial or other neighbors to oppose a project.
This is Jared. Yeah, so we're staff's exploring refinements to the other criteria to set more objective standards that'll facilitate projects moving forward under this policy. As a work item in the housing crisis work plan. We're anticipating that work will be completed by early 2021 so that it can be brought forward at the same time as the changes for the commercial requirements that are being contemplated tonight.
Perfect, thank you.
Harvey, any questions that you have?
Yes, indeed. This is to Rosalind and Michael. If you remember back when a couple of years ago, there was a project proposed on Lincoln Avenue for a small parcel that was zoned, I can't remember what the zoning was, but the owner wanted to put in a quote unquote affordable housing. Would that parcel have been qualified under this new suggestion?
Hi, Harvey. I'm not sure if I recall that particular project, but, and Kulan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, what staff is now proposing is if an affordable housing project does meet the criteria that staff is recommending, then yes, it would be allowed.
I can respond to that. So yeah, that was the teacher housing project on Lincoln near, was it Malone or Kirtner?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So unknown. So one of the issues with that project was that you needed to have residential on 2 sides. That was changed by the council, consistent with the original task force recommendation, to make it, you only had to be adjacent to residential on 1 side. So this policy change, we're doing further work on this policy change to make the standards more clear and objective. So I think we'll have to see what, it'll depend on that work. So what this policy is really about is if that project could go forward and that site is defined as underutilized, then they wouldn't have to replace the commercial there. They could just build all affordable.
So the one side can be the very rear of the property could have.
Yes.
And that would qualify. So all of Lincoln Avenue could qualify just about for affordable housing.
Well, yes, but it's about, that's only one of the criteria. There's actually a lot of the other criteria. Is the site vacant or underutilized?
No, I understand. But if businesses go out, then could convert parts of the commercial areas to housing. Okay, thank you.
And
Okay,
Harvey,
go ahead, Rosalind.
No, so that project obviously came to my mind immediately, the affordable teacher housing project. So as I recall, there was an existing retail establishment on the site. So that would not have qualified as underutilized.
All right, thank you. Eric Schoenauer?
Thank you, David. This is Eric Schoenauer. I actually had two questions. The first was, I was confused by why we had the description of the new policy for neighborhood business districts in the 13th Street and Calle Willow. Were we talking about that, or what was that? Why was that brought up this meeting?
Sure, that was a recap of last meeting and the recommendations that the task force provided on that topic. So we were just trying to recap that discussion from last meeting.
Okay. And so I saw there that the staff's supposed to come back with some description or definition of what protect small business means, because that is very amorphous.
Right. Yeah, and I believe that work would happen kind of in parallel or outside of the task force. Like that work, it wouldn't come back to the task force directly, but that we would be working on that in coordination with OED in their team and the work that they're doing now.
Okay. And so back to the current topic then, criteria 2, which says that the site has to be vacant or underutilized, that has already been problematic because staff has on some sites claimed that the site is not underutilized, while development interest would argue that it is underutilized. And so somehow getting clarity on the definition of underutilized would be very important. In my opinion, if there's a 1-story building on it in this city, by definition, that's underutilized. And I know staff doesn't agree with that viewpoint. So that needs to be fixed somehow.
Okay, anything else? Any other questions? Remember, we're trying to stick with questions, and we will set aside time for comments, which Eric, you're expressing, and I understand that, but let's just stay focused on questions now. Any other questions that you have, Eric?
No, thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Next, Jesse O'Malley Solis.
Thank you. I was curious, could staff give a little bit of context on what the reach of this current policy is? How many sites does this policy, as already in place or with these edits, how many sites citywide would this actually apply to? Can you provide a map that has context? It doesn't seem like this would apply to very many sites.
Yeah, sure. So it applies just using the locational criteria. It applies to about approximately 1,000 sites. Of course, some of the criteria is rather subjective, and we're working on coming up with more objective criteria for that, which would be brought forward. But with the current criteria as it is, there's about 1,000 sites just using the locational criteria, and then of course that would be whittled down once you apply some of the other criteria. And as we move forward with defining the additional criteria, those sites could be better identified.
Any other follow-up questions, Jesse?
No, thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. Okay, next I've got Jesus Flores.
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone. I do have a question I believe is similar to the previous. I hear a couple of times that staff is recommending to develop ways to protect businesses. And also mentions that small businesses need to be protected. we are voting today, but do we have a plan of how these businesses will be protected? Has staff started developing ways to protect businesses? And can we get that information? How are we going to be protecting the businesses? If, again, if we're signing, voting for this today?
Speaking that in the context of the policy, so for this particular policy, the intent of it is that these would be sites that are not well positioned for commercial uses, which is why the exception is being made to allow affordable housing to move forward on those sites. In terms of business displacement, we're certainly the city is working hard on that, and that effort's being led by OED, and I know they gave Vic Farland from OED gave a presentation last meeting, and that work will continue to progress because it's a very critical issue as you've raised.
And as a follow-up, you mentioned that there are about 1,000 sites. Do you have a map of at least where most of those sites are at?
Yeah, we'd be happy to provide that as a follow-up to the meeting. We can provide that to the task force. Sites that are less than 1.5 acres, that are they would be located on sites that have a land use designation of mixed use commercial and neighborhood community commercial, and that are along train.
Okay, anything else, Jesus? Thank you. Okay, next, Councilmember Sylvia Reyes. Councilmember Reyes.
I'm so sorry. I was having technical difficulties. I have this mouse that I was relying on and got lost in the shuffle. Anyways, I was hoping that I was going to speak after Leslie, because I thought I pushed the button after Leslie Corsiglia.
Sure, we can wait.
Yeah, I want to wait because I wanted her to bring up the point that she had brought up in the letter, and what we discussed earlier, Jared and Michael. But I don't want to step ahead of myself. And first, I wanted to let the discussion flow. So I'll speak after. Thank you.
So let me just remind folks again, and I did see the letter. It's on the website from Leslie and Bray. I do want to keep this part of the meeting about questions. Since we have a large group, I think it's best productive before people start taking comments right out of the box, that we just get questions, clarifications, so we all have the same information. And then I do want to hear from the public first, and then we'll go to what people's thoughts are on the staff recommendation. So Leslie, any questions that you have at this time?
Yeah, I have a few. So I'd like to follow up from Jesse's comment and ask a couple of clarifying questions about the 1.5 acre rule. When was that adopted, and how many projects have been approved?
So that was adopted with the last task force review process. So that would have been in 2016. I believe council adopted that. We made amendments to the policy in 2018. So that took it from, there's the criteria that required residential on 2 sides. That went down to 1 side. That opened up a lot more sites. It went from 300 some odd sites up to 1,000. And with that policy, we are just about to approve our first project using that policy.
I think that's a really important point for this conversation. So it was 4 years ago that the policy was approved, and you are just about to approve your first project. So I guess my second question to you then would be, last time we talked about the amendment to the urban villages, and this time the staff is recommending that we add a change to the 1.5 acre rule. Are there affordable housing projects that are being proposed that are not in urban villages and that are not 1.5 acre rule projects? And it's a trick question because I know.
Well, let's not do trick questions. I mean, let's just save those comments. I want you to be able to have as much opportunity, of course, Leslie, to make your comments on things, but I really want to use this time for things that might assist everybody.
But I think, David, it is an important question. Are there projects? We had asked the staff to come back with a policy that exempted affordable housing from the commercial requirement. And I'm just asking straight up, is what the recommendation before us today, does that do that? So I'll leave it at that and I can speak more to it. But I think it's a really important question.
I can respond to that. So, and I talked to Matthew on the phone beforehand about this. So the scope is related to general plan. We're right here where this group is tasked with looking at the general plan and making changes and course corrections or whatever to the general plan. And so the general plan has 3 policies that require currently commercial to affordable. There's only really 3, and that's the signature project, the urban village policy. I can't remember the number, but allows affordable housing projects to jump ahead of a village plan or a horizon. And there's this one. So there aren't other general plan policies that require housing. There may be a specific plan that has requirements in certain locations. Approved urban village plans have commercial requirements for housing, things like that, but they're not part of the general plan. We're not cognizant of all the affordable housing projects being proposed right now, but there is one, for example, that is proposed that's not downtown and not in an urban village and not in a specific plan. And that's I think it's a homeless supportive project on 4th Street at the old Dick's Market at Younger and 4th. And that is the project that is using the current 1.5 acre rural policy that we're talking about tonight.
So the general plan could not have a policy that was broader than those 3 policies that are existing right now. There could be an addition that creates a policy for this.
Well, I mean, you could have a policy like that. I think it would largely be a preemptive policy, or it could be a policy that overrides policies with an individual already approved council planning documents like specific plans and urban village plans, etc. They're all, yeah. So, I mean, you could do that, but there isn't a general plan citywide policy requiring affordable housing to provide commercial. So if you have a site that's designated in the general plan for high density housing or whatever housing it is, you can build 100% affordable housing on that site. It's only when you layer on the urban villages or it's a commercial property that you're trying to convert, which is the policy before you tonight.
Or you require a CUP of some sort.
Well, no, the zoning is relatively irrelevant. It really is about what does the general plan say? And so that's kind of what this group is tasked to do is, are there general plan tweaks that we need to make? So in the general rule is that, if you want to redevelop a site, you look to what the general plan allows to sort of guidance of what you can build. And the zoning is changed to be consistent with the general plan. And as of state law changes now, you don't even have to change the zoning. You're allowed to build essentially what the general plan says without rezoning your property because of recent state law for housing.
Any follow-up questions, Leslie, on that?
No, I just really want to get clarity on whether or not, as a task force, we can recommend a new general plan policy that says that commercial is not required for affordable housing.
Well, I think as Michael explained that affordable housing planned on properties that are planned residential don't have the requirement at all. And that properties where it's mixed use or commercial, there are the current restrictions that's in the policy that's being proposed to change now. I guess is the question, is there some other policy within the general plan that has not been brought to the task force that still imposes commercial space building requirements? Is that the question?
No, I think the question is there not a way for us to add something that says that? But if that's not the appropriate way, and the appropriate way is for council policy, then that's also, that's good for us to know, because I do believe that the task force at the last meeting, or I guess in January, thought that it was suggesting a broader policy than one that was fairly restrictive to what's before us today. So it may be that there's another way to get what we're suggesting, but we can talk about that more.
Okay. Ray, I think you were next, Ray Bramson. Did you have some questions?
I put my hand down. Leslie took my questions.
Okay. Thank you, Ray. Councilmember Arenas, I was going to return to you.
You know, this really goes along with what Leslie was bringing up, and I know that we spoke about this earlier, Michael and Jared, and in the last meeting, I think somebody had brought up the NBDs. I can't remember the acronym, but there was different set of rules for those projects, and so I'm just wondering how we can apply different rules, maybe some blanket rules for projects, possibly like in, oh, thank you, Teresa. Oh, this is awesome. Working from home and Zoom, I love it. So my question would be, how would this the recommendation really impact or affect the attempts to build affordable housing in urban villages that have already urban village plans? And Jared and Michael, we talked a little bit about this. So that would be the question, without going further into the discussion, because I know that you're trying to clear up. These are informational questions, or trying to clear up our understanding, and so I know we're moving into discussion. So I'll hold off. That would be my question. Thank you.
Right. So yeah, basically, so the policies that we brought forward for discussion for the task force are the ones they're in the general plan. Those are the 3 policies, as Michael mentioned, that that have requirements for affordable projects to include commercial. There were the 2, in urban villages, and then this one we're discussing tonight that's outside of it. The urban village plans, they're extension of the general plan, like a specific plan. So those policies are specific to those individual villages. Those plans have gone through extensive community outreach, really to establish their land use designations and policies. So changing those plans specifically, or eliminating requirements, or setting a policy where you similar to the NBDs, where maybe there would just be a requirement to replace the commercial that's there, or some portion thereof. It could necessitate really focused updates of those 12 adopted urban village plans. That said, staff's currently working on creating new plans now. We'll also be updating plans in the future. So I think there's opportunity there to look at commercial requirements for affordable housing projects through that process.
Policy that's being proposed tonight. There would no longer be any requirement for replacing or building or providing commercial space by 100% affordable housing projects on the sites that are eligible under the 1.5 acre rule, correct?
That's correct. So yeah, what's before you tonight is the 1.5 acre rule. And so those are for sites outside of urban villages that are 1.5 acres located on those commercially designated properties that meet the subject criteria. You know, as I mentioned, the two other policies are focused on urban villages, and the
Okay.
task force gave recommendation on those.
And this issue has come back to the task force because if I recollect, Leslie, it was you who had reminded staff that this was a referral to the task force that wasn't being addressed when we had that prior discussion. It was something that was part of the housing crisis work plan, correct?
Yeah, the housing crisis work plan said review the commercial requirements for affordable housing citywide. So not just on 1.5 acres that meet the specified criteria of the policy before us today, not just in urban villages, but citywide.
So let me ask this to staff. Is there any other policy, whether it's in the general plan, the council policy manual, zoning requirements, any place that requires 100% affordable housing to build or replace or provide commercial space?
No, those are the three policies in the general plan that touch on this.
So if we approve this in combination with the policies that were already approved, there wouldn't be any policy in place in the city that's going to put on the backs of affordable housing developers commercial development requirements. Is that true or not?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Leslie, do you have different information about that?
Well, I mean, it's happening. So I think that's the issue. There are projects that are, as the staff has said, they've in the last 4 years have not approved even a project under the 1.5 acre rule yet. And then there are a number of projects that have been approved in urban villages, but there have also been projects approved outside urban villages that have been required to provide commercial. And that's what we thought, maybe mistakenly, but we thought that the conversation was that it would be citywide and not just in specific locations. So what I heard from Michael is he's saying that he doesn't think that's a general plan conversation, that this is something that is being required outside the general plan. And so that was my question. Could it be a council policy or something else that would have the same effect?
All right, and I thought I was pretty clear that when I asked staff the question, I asked whether it was the general plan, zoning, council policy, anything. Is there any policy, law, rule, regulation that's in place in the city right now, if we approve this last piece tonight, that requires commercial development by 100% affordable housing projects?
Right, in approved urban village, urban villages with approved plans have their own requirements for commercial space. And now those policies are within the, specific to those urban village plans and not within the general plan themselves.
Okay.
Yeah, and so also just, I don't think you said urban village plans. Oh God. But also specific plans. Did you say that, Jared? So we have specific plans. There's not many left, but Martha Gardens is one that comes to mind. I think on South First Street, it requires commercial. And just full disclosure, we do have a policy and zoning for certain streets in downtown that require commercial. It's for any use. It's use agnostic. But what we did a whole downtown retail strategy. And it kind of actually tightened up some key corridors that were defined as retail corridors, and the other streets were let go, and so they don't need to have any active uses on the ground floor. It's really more about active uses on the ground floor. So there is an ordinance and policies in downtown related to that on specific streets.
Okay.
Those would apply to any development: commercial, office buildings, market rate housing, hotels, affordable.
let's go to.
Can I continue with my question since that was the answer to my question? Because I think if we're trying to find a way to make this citywide without messing up already pre-existing urban village plans, then we should consider putting that kind of criteria, the same criteria that that was similar to the NBDs, the neighborhood business districts, and apply those rules as criteria for urban villages that already exist. Otherwise, that's the group that will continue to be outside of this.
Okay, let's go to Bonnie Mace with questions.
Yeah, it's sort of similar to Leslie's idea, but so we have 7 criteria and we're getting rid of 1, or we're modifying 1 of those 7, right, Michael? So is there some reason why, and that 1 criteria, it's going to open up 1,000 sites, but to Leslie's point, that doesn't mean 1,000 developers are going to rush and do those 1,000 sites. So in order for us not to come back, is there some reason why we're not modifying the other criteria or some of the other criteria as well? Like number 2, the underutilized sites, etc. Thank you.
Right. So what we're talking about tonight doesn't affect the number of sites that Jared mentioned. Jared mentioned there's 1,000 sites that meet the locational criteria. There's actually a lot less once you get into the underutilized and other things. But this policy doesn't affect that number. The reason we're only talking about the the commercial requirement part is because that's within the scope of the 4-year review task force process. The other pieces of it are part of our housing crisis work program, and we're not as far along in that work. Well, we're not as far. That's not the reason. The reason it's not part of the scope of this task force, but we're also not that far along in that work as we are with this one policy about the commercial requirement.
All right. I see hands up for Harvey and Jesus, but since I already called on you, I'm going to next go to Susan Butler Graham.
Hi.
Hi.
Just quickly, could this unintentionally create food deserts in some areas? Or does number 3 take care of that?
Yeah. So I think the idea of this policy, again, is it's underutilized and vacant land. So I think the thought is there's probably not a market, thriving grocery store that's there now. So by allowing affordable housing to be built on the site, it wouldn't be vacating a grocery store and thereby creating a food desert. So we don't think so. Yeah, that would result in that.
Well, I think what I'm saying is if you're putting a bunch of families into an area that is a commercial zone, there may not be any stores there. I'm just concerned that would they have access to things that families need? But or is it not really an issue?
Yeah, I mean, don't know. I mean, we don't have that as a criteria. Yeah, we don't have that as a criteria. So I can tell you from other work that I've been involved in, there's not a lot of food deserts in San Jose, is my understanding. That being said, there are a lot of places in San Jose where you do have to get in your car and drive a little ways to get what you need to meet your daily needs. And so that's kind of one of the things that the urban village strategy is hoping to address. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Let's go to Juan Estrada.
Hi.
Hi.
I think this was partially cleared up earlier, but so the question we're being asked is, do we want to accept the recommendation about striking bullet number 6, or do we have a different recommendation regarding bullet number 6? Or do we want to make no recommendation? Are those our 3 options?
I'll just jump in here. What came back to the task force was an item from the housing crisis work plan that was considered part of our scope of work, which was whether or not 100% affordable housing developments should or shouldn't be required to replace commercial space. With the staff recommendation in order to support affordable housing development, which has been admittedly slow, the staff recommendation is to remove that obligation. And it's up to each task force member to decide whether you'd like to see that or not.
Right. So we are only being asked. I'm just trying to get a good sense of the scope, because I know there are a lot of different topics that we could discuss. And so let me give you an example. There's a different topic that addresses one or more concerns. Then it's not what we're looking at now. And is there a portion in the meeting where somebody could suggest that for a future meeting?
Sure, why don't, we'll keep it a mystery for now, what it is, Juan, but you can bring it up after we have our vote, or when we get to that vote. Why don't you bring it up then, okay?
Yeah, I'm not trying to bring it up. I'm just trying to make sure I understand what we are discussing and what we will vote on. And
Well, yeah,
is it
good
basically a yes
question.
or a no? Are we only talking about 6, support the recommendation, make a different recommendation regarding number 6, or make no recommendation?
I think the entire policy is in front of the task force right now. So that's something you can all comment on, and when we get to that, which we hopefully will get to that very shortly. Okay.
I just want to clarify something. I think Juan is generally correct. So what the task force is being asked, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, is where the scope within the task force is talk about the commercial requirements for affordable. That's the item for you to pass a recommendation on. The rest of the policy, you're welcome to talk about it or give your thoughts, but that rest of the policy is outside of the council approved scope for this task force.
Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you, Juan. Okay, so let's just see here. I'm going to go back. Harvey, if you've got your hand still raised here, is it?
It is.
Okay, just
a couple follow-up questions. I just want to understand what affordable housing criteria are. Is it LI, VLI, ELI, or is it just under market rate?
So we define that in the general definition that we refer to. If you give me 1 second. So it's 100% deed restricted for a period not less than 55 years to low income residents earning 80% or less of the area median income.
Okay, that's helpful for me. Thank you. And then the other question is, it occurred to me that if a commercial site in an area that is less than 1.5 acres burned, and the owner of the site did not have the wherewithal to rebuild, would that then become underutilized under your criteria?
Can you repeat that again, Harvey? Just want to make sure I understand that.
Okay, a commercial site that is under 1.5 acres burns, and the owner has had it forever and doesn't have the ability to rebuild. Would that then qualify as a underutilized site?
It would, I guess it would depend on the, we would look at the other criteria depending on the, location, but that's a good question. If the site was then vacant for some time, we would take a look at that. Typically, to demo a building, you would need to replace it. But yeah, I mean, if the site were to stay vacant for some period of time, I suppose that could be a possibility under this policy that it would then qualify as a vacant or underutilized site.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Harvey. Jesus Flores, did you have some additional questions?
Yes, just one quick question. before I believe we will have a chance to do comments after questions.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, the question is if staff has started a process of identifying sites or where these eliminated commercial sites will be redistributed, if staff has started that process.
Well, we are exploring the other criteria. If that's your question, we're going to be looking at the underutilized criteria and other criteria in the policy that would then help narrow down those sites.
The question was actually if we understand that there are some places that will be replaced, there will not be any new commercial space built there if this policy is approved. If the staff has already identified sites that can be used as commercial, or those businesses that might be displaced, because I still believe that there's going to be a lot of business displacement after these changes, where those will be relocated to, or if there are new construction way allocated for commercial.
Right. Yeah, in the context of this, for this policy, I think that would go in line with our work that OED is doing. For this policy, it's really focused on sites that are underutilized. So our hope is that the business displacement, particularly as it relates to this policy, would be minimal, because these are sites that would likely be whether they're vacant or they may have vacancies on them currently, long-standing vacancies.
Okay, so that will be then the definition of underutilized. To be vacant for a long period of time, or to not have any businesses located at the current site, or as Harvey was mentioning, if there was a drastic change. There was a business previously, but then the building burned down and the owner doesn't want to rebuild a business. Will that be under the criteria of underutilized?
That could jump in. I think this is stuff that we are still working through. So we don't have an answer of what we're recommending on this because we don't have a recommendation yet. So, but we're just taking your comments on that, and we'll consider that as we. I think we're concerned about the business displacement issue. I mean, we're kind of hearing that as a comment. We will take that under consideration as something to think about as we craft the definition of vacant and underutilized.
Okay, Eric Janauer, I think you were next.
Yeah, so we're spending a lot of time on one sentence that's going to have minimal benefit or impact on producing affordable housing. As to the question of should we support a sentence that says that affordable housing shouldn't have to provide commercial space, I think the clear answer is yes, we should support that. But in this policy construct, the big hurdle to new development is criteria 2 and the word underutilized. First of all, let's just acknowledge there basically is no vacant land in San Jose. It's extremely rare that there's a vacant parcel. So that's inoperative. And if it were vacant, it would have no commercial requirement anyway because it's vacant. So the word underutilized is the big issue here. And staff has consistently taken a very cautious and conservative interpretation of the word underutilized. And basically, if there's a building on it, it's utilized. And the planning director said as much at the beginning of the meeting when she talked about the teacher housing project on Lincoln Avenue, saying that there was a retail building on the site and therefore it wasn't underutilized. Well, that site has, I think that retail building is 1 story and covers about 20% of the site. The remainder of the site is a surface parking lot. 80% of the site is a surface parking lot. And the conclusion of the planning department is it's not underutilized. So we can talk all we want about criteria 6, but if the definition of underutilized isn't changed, there will be no new residential development in this city. And let me also just clarify what Jared and Michael said. When they say 1,000 sites, they clearly use the term meet the geographic criteria. So all that means is there's 1,000 sites in the city's GIS system that are 1.5 acres and have residential on one side. That 1,000 sites has not gone through any screening on the criteria of underutilized. And if you apply underutilized to that 1,000 sites, we'd be lucky to find any that would be available for affordable housing.
Did you have a question, Eric?
I thought we had moved beyond the question.
No, we hadn't really, but if you do have a question.
The question is,
Can you frame that in the form of a question?
This discussion, I'm just trying to keep this in a certain order. And I'm sure people from the public who are participating tonight would like to be heard before everybody starts forming their own opinions. So I'd like to go to that at this point in time. That's item 5, public comment. And I'm going to ask the staff to help manage that because that's going beyond my expertise on Zoom. So Jessica, are you going to manage this?
Yes, I am. So I'd like to begin by reminding everyone that the Code of Conduct for public meetings still stands and that no disparaging remarks towards individuals or groups of people or profanity will be tolerated. So for those of you who haven't already joined the public comment queue, I don't see any right now. Now's the time to do so. So if you're on a computer or tablet, you just press the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom window, or if you're calling in, you can press *9 to activate the raise hand feature. When it's your turn, I'll say your name or the last 3 digits of your phone number, and then after that, you should be able to unmute yourself and speak for the allotted 2 minutes. Kulon has the screen shared, and she'll begin the timer once we can hear your voice. Also, if you don't feel comfortable providing your comments verbally, feel free to email us at generalplanstaff@sanjoseca.gov. It looks like we have one public commenter. Matthew, please unmute yourself and you may begin your comment.
Yes, this is Matthew from Silicon Valley at home. I'm sure thousands are, and I appreciate his being available. I think the general point that I want to make is that there is development and residential development that happens outside of planned areas in the city. And subsequently, they fall outside of the sort of the rules and the structures of the general plan. Some of them do fall within the general plan. There are planned development areas that are not urban villages and are not part of the 1.5 acre rule. They include huge portions of downtown, this Dearden Station area, North San Jose. These are areas where housing is planned and are not covered so far by the actions that this body has taken. There are also areas that are just outside of planned areas where people do build housing. And right now in that environment, it's a complicated of return to the zoning codes and conditional use permits and special use permits and zoning variances, zoning category changes. And this is where planner discretion and political intervention really shapes cities' priorities, makes it very, very difficult to navigate, and we believe is killing opportunities to bring affordable housing to good sites in the city. There's no reason to limit this going forward. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Is there anyone else that would like to speak? Going once, going twice. And I think that's it for public comment since we have no other speakers. So I'll throw it back to you, David.
Okay.
move forward with the recommendation.
Okay, so you know what I'd like to do first, Leslie, I wanted to call on you. You had your hand up too anyway, because, and you and Ray had submitted a letter. So now's the time to make any comments and suggestions in regard to the issue that's before us tonight.
Great, thank you, David. You know, I first wanted to really thank Rosalind for her comments at the very beginning, because I think this is a really critical time for the community and for housing. The housing market has created over the years systemic problems that need to be addressed, but nationwide that need to be rethought. And so I think some of the work that this body is doing can help that. But I think that I really appreciated your comments, and I think we need to do whatever we can. I think it's also raised the fact that housing and homelessness has to be a priority. Because we've got people who need to stay in place and need a home to do that, and we've really seen the importance and the connection of housing and health. So I want to raise that, but you know, to the issue at point today, Ray and I did submit a letter and to remind the task force why we're having this conversation. Commercial space in affordable housing is very challenging. Affordable housing finance does not allow you to pay for the commercial space. And so it needs to be paid for by other sources, which there aren't other sources. So what ends up happening in many cases is that you end up with cold shell, and it requires significant amounts of money to be able to make this available for other uses. Originally in our memo that we put forward in January, we did say eliminate commercial requirements, but in those cases where it made sense, we gave a few different options for what could be done, including establishing a small city fund that would help pay for that to build out that space. So we believe that what's before us today is a little too limited, which in my questions I had said that before. It's obvious, and to Eric's point, the 1.5 acre rule really hasn't done very much, even if there are 1,000 potential parcels. We're just not seeing that happening. So by making the change, we may affect a few parcels, but it's certainly not going to be a big change. So I think what I would like to do is to go forward and recommend that we approve the staff recommendation, because I think that we do need to take that requirement out of the 1.5 acre rule. But that we also take whatever action or direct or recommend to the council that they look at either a new general plan policy, or if it's not appropriate, that it be a general plan policy, another policy that makes it so that projects outside of urban villages and outside of the 1.5 acre rule are not required to provide commercial when it just doesn't work, because there are many.
Do you want to make a motion then?
Yeah,
I
make a motion to approve staff recommendation, but to recommend that either the staff look at other options, or that the council approve a policy.
Was there a second on that? Who did that?
Linda Lazat.
Ray? Who?
Linda Lazat.
Thank you, Linda. Ray, let me call on you next, because you co-wrote that letter with Leslie.
Sure. And, you know, Leslie said most everything that I would say, but I just, you know, I think it's worth highlighting that when we talk about 100% deed restricted affordable housing, sadly, we're talking about a small fraction of the total housing being built citywide. We're not talking about major displacement. We're not talking about thousands and thousands of parcels being taken up. We're talking about just a few limited opportunities, and it's getting harder and harder to build affordable every day. I appreciate staff's recommendation to remove the commercial requirement. from the 1.5 acre rule. But to Eric's point, I think we're going to have to do more than that with the 1.5 acre rule to make it work, because I've done some ground truthing with some of our development partners at those sites, and there are not many good sites in that 1,000. So we have to do everything we can, I think, to get out of the way and to make things possible. So I'm very supportive of Leslie's motion. I think this is a time now more than ever that we're going to need housing for the most vulnerable in our community, because there's a lot more people whose incomes are nothing, are a lot less or zero than they were a few months ago. So affordable housing is going to be critical for our community. And if we can make even a policy statement back to council that we don't think commercial, which is a killer for 100% affordable, should be required anywhere in our city, I think that's another step forward to trying to get to a place where we can produce as much housing as possible. Thank you.
All right, and let me have one clarification here. I think, as Michael had explained, that the issue that's before us, that's within the work plan, is the commercial space requirement. But Michael had also said that it would be appropriate for the task force to share comments with the council with respect to the other criteria that are in that 1.5 acre rule policy. So we can make a recommendation on the commercial space requirement, but nothing precludes us from sharing comments with the council as well with respect to the other criteria. And I believe, Eric, you had mentioned one of them being the vacant. I'm not going to ask you to reframe your motion yet. I think what might be a kind of a collaborative way to deal with this is, let's hear from other people on the task force, and then I'll come back to you and see if there's any changes you want to make in your motion. Is that okay? Okay. So Jesse O'Malley Solis, I think you were next. Did you have some comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that while I support staff's recommendation in the motion, Leslie's point that so far the existing policy has only been taken advantage of by one project, really stripping one criterion out of 9 when you look at them. I know there's 7 listed, but there's 2 more in the text above. Stripping 1 of 9 qualifiers feels pretty meaningless. I question the scope and the reach of this policy change. I think staff should affirm council's direction, asking our task force to review this policy. If the intent was to remove commercial requirements for 100% affordable housing, this recommendation really misses the mark significantly, in my opinion. If staff and this motion wants to create additional change or have additional reach, I think it should strip additional restricting criteria. That's it.
Are there comments that you would like conveyed to the council with respect to any of the other criteria in the policy?
David, are you asking me that specifically?
Yeah.
I think the fact that when you look at all of the criteria, even stripping out number 6, the reach of this policy is relatively minimal, meaning we're talking about a small handful of sites citywide. And I just feel like, you know, the vast majority of these criteria need to be seriously analyzed, because this policy is essentially meaningless if nobody can take advantage of it.
All right, so your comment would be that the council should re-examine the totality of the policy in a way to see how it could be modified to improve the production of affordable housing?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, let's go to Robert Levy. Bob?
Thank you. I'd sort of like to echo what's been very little value to this, because there's going to be very little development that takes place because of it. And so I tend to agree with Eric that, the policy number 2 needs to be addressed before we really can go forward. So the scope of this question isn't large enough for really us to make any type of impact. The other policy or the other criteria here is criteria 4, the development will not impact viable commercial properties, businesses. Well, that's a very important policy of the city too. We're, fiscally very poor city, and we need to protect our tax revenue, especially with what's going to go on with COVID. And so what does this really mean if there's a so it's really hard to understand how policy 4 plays into this as well. And somebody mentioned earlier, what's the definition of underutilized from a temporal perspective? With COVID, we're going to see a lot of failures in small businesses, particularly restaurants. And so there's going to be a lot more available space potentially. But the city also wants to maintain the viability of these business districts. So how these two interplay with each other is unknown based on just looking at the policy. It's going to be based on, judgment and political decision making on how these play out. So I do support the amendment or the proposal, the motion, but like I said, I'm not sure how it, from the big picture perspective, I don't really see how it all plays out.
All right, let's go to Juan Estrada.
Hello, give me just a second. I have to switch from Zoom to the document. I also support the motion. I understand that we are providing commentary on additional bullets that could be or should be changed. I agree with the need to clarify, underutilize, or revisit that. That's for number 2. In response to feedback from other task force members, I would say that number 4, perhaps, instead of just noting that it should not impact the viability of surrounding commercial or industrial properties or businesses, if that doesn't already refer to small businesses, it should. And so that would be my comment. And that's consistent with number 1, I think then is a limiting factor, if I understand correctly. I'm not a developer, but I'm assuming it is. And so perhaps the 1.5 acre or less criteria should be changed. I would defer to someone who is a developer on the task force to tell us what a better number would be. But it seems like if that was increased, then the number of eligible pieces of land would increase. And so that's my final comment. If there is a developer that has a better sense of what that number should be, please do feel free to recommend changes.
Okay. Let's see. Michelle Yesney. Michelle?
Thank you, David. As a land use planner, the hair stands up on the back of my neck when we start talking about introducing new land uses into areas where they were not previously allowed. There are a number of factors in, for example, the city's zoning ordinance that says that if there's residential adjacent to your business, you can't use your back setback area for storage. You can't do anything outdoors after 11 o'clock at night. You're not allowed to generate noise over a certain level. You're not allowed to do anything that generates any kind of smoke, odor, noise, anything untoward. So the minute residential goes in along an adjacent property line, the things you can do for your business are changed. And so that's something that certainly should be taken into account. The issue of compatibility goes both ways. This criteria had, I think, you have to have residential on one adjacent property line already, which is a good thing, because there sometimes is this eagerness to put in affordable housing in areas where there is no housing. And the reason there's no housing there is because it's not a very nice place to live. So when we put in affordable housing, I think it's incredibly important that we put it someplace where people would want to live, not cram it into corners where the environment is unsuitable to have children or to try to sleep at night or to keep your home clean. If there's already residential along one property line, there's at least some hope that residential is, it's going to be a compatible use because it will be next to other residential. And that creates the beginning of a neighborhood. So the idea of changing or eliminating these criteria, in my opinion, is not something to be taken lightly or simply suggested as a blanket change. Changing one criterion is a minimal change, and maybe it's not enough by itself, but we shouldn't be recommending automatically that the other criteria be changed as well, because I don't think we would be doing a service to either the businesses in the area or the people who might live on this property. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Let me go to, sorry. Councilmember Arenas.
Okay, I thought there was other folks in front of me. I was, I'm actually supporting the motion, and because it really addresses the point I was trying to make about urban villages and how those plans would just be stuck with the plan that they currently have. Not that most of them are moving quickly, but at least this would allow for some of that to be applied broadly. And so, and it also addresses the question that Matt had about North San Jose and Diridon. So some of these exceptions that all different folks are coming up with. And so I was looking at the minutes of the council meeting where the scope was set and where this came from. And so I want to read off what it actually says. It says, additionally, a verbal addendum from staff's presentation was approved to explore changes to commercial space requirements for affordable housing developments. And so I read this really broadly. I don't know that it has some of the limitations that people have the impression it does. And I think that the motion on the floor is broad enough and goes far enough to be able to support where it makes sense to build more affordable housing.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Jeffrey Buchanan. Jeffrey?
Yep. No, I would like to support the motion on the floor. My only comment would be, historically, I know at one point, rather than a 1.5 acre rule, we were talking about a 2 acre rule. And I know that's something that had been discussed in the past. And so would hope, in whatever like sidebar communication that we're sending to council, thinking about what that number should be. Juan made the point earlier, but I think it's important to have that kind of historical grounding that it wasn't always 1.5. It used to be 2. And I think in recent time, there's been some discussion about that, at least maybe a couple years back, it was before the council. So amongst those potential areas for council to consider change, perhaps also that size of parcel part of the question, we should include in a communication to council.
Can I get a clarification from staff on that issue? Was there previously a 2 acre exception as opposed to 1.5?
Well, the previous general plan 2020 had a whole slew of policies related to parcels that were 2 acres or less that allowed excuse me, that allowed a lot of flexibility. That was the general plan 2020. You could do different uses. You could go up density, down density. There was a lot of flexibility, and those policies weren't carried over to Envision San Jose 2040 because the task force said that the general plan 2020 was a general plan of exceptions. So that didn't carry forward. When we did talk about the 1.5 acre rule, we actually consulted with affordable housing developers, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jared, that was sort of that threshold and below is generally what the size of the properties that they would be looking for their development. I mean, council could always expand it. I don't actually think there's a lot more properties if you expand it to 2 acres, but I don't remember. Jared might know.
Correct. Yeah, when we did the analysis last, the previous task force process, yeah, that was kind of there was that discussion on what would be the appropriate size, and the task force felt like with you know, the input from affordable housing developers that was a good size in terms of the parcels. When we analyzed going up to something larger, say 2 acres, I think the amount of sites gained were pretty minimal. The number was very small. There really wasn't much of a difference there.
Let's go to Linda Lazat. And just remind people, you don't have to stick your hand up in the camera. Just click on the part. I'm seeing you, Eric. I also just click on the participant thing and you will get called on. So Linda, are you here? Linda Lazat?
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Thanks, David.
Sure.
And I think Eric has gone way over his 3-minute limit, so I think we should shut his mic off. With regard to the conversation, you know, I seconded the motion because I think it's, you know, incredibly important what we're doing here with regard to affordable housing. But I also want to agree with Bob Levy and Michelle Yesney with regard to item 2. I think we got to be really, really cautious in this particular moment in time in looking at vacant, or what's, you know, euphemistically called underutilized. And it's, you know, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. So I think that, you know, we should, you know, our comments to the council are fine. And there's 3 council members here. There's the planning director here, you know, but I want to be really careful and not, you know, kind of saying, oh, wow, all these sites are vacant. Now we can just, you know, move in with housing, particularly with regard to small businesses, if it's, you know, currently might be underutilized, as Bob was talking to. And I think that goes hand in hand with number 4, you know, that the development wouldn't impact the viability of surrounding commercial. And I think it's not so much that the housing would impact it, but the lack of maybe the commercial that was there, and because it's underutilized, suddenly disappears because we're looking for affordable housing sites. So I think those two kind of go hand in hand, and we just need to, you know, send our comments over to the council. But the other thing is, if I was on the council still, I would not be happy with the 1,000 number that was quoted by staff. I would want to know exactly, you know, what sites are we talking about? You know, do they meet any of this criteria? Are they underutilized? Are they vacant? And rather than just saying, oh, this policy change will open up 1,000 sites. I don't think that's correct. And then with regard to what Michelle said with regard to, you know, housing is forever, but it also has to be in places that it's going to be successful and not hurt small businesses. So while we're, you know, because while we're looking at helping, you know, our communities with affordable housing, we also have to be cautious of, you know, turning properties in this particular moment in time that are filled with small businesses or places where small businesses could thrive in the next economy to come. So I just wanted to add those comments, and shut Eric's mic off, will you?
Thank you, Linda. Jesse, did you have some further comments? Jesse O'Malley Solis? Okay.
Yeah. Hi, David. Thank you.
Hi.
You had posed a question to me, and I wasn't prepared at the moment, but listening to the commentary and studying the policy, you know, I think it may be wise for the task force to consider reducing the size from 1.5 acres down to 1, and removal of criterion 2, and perhaps even amending criteria 5 to capture both the walk and bike shed. The current criteria in 5 limits the site capture to 1/2 mile of existing transit lines. As a transit professional and representing VTA, we really encourage increasing both market rate and affordable densities in our walk and bike shed, and our bike shed expands out to the 3-mile mark. So I wanted to add that to the discussion.
Okay. I'm not sure the 1 acre suggestion, I'm not sure how that would apply, because I believe 1 already says 1.5 acre or less. You want to reduce the number of sites to smaller sites, is that it? Or you're thinking it would increase the number of sites? Maybe I could ask staff that, what effect?
I was thinking it would increase because, yeah. Thanks.
Jared, can you help us on that? What effect
Sure.
would that have generally?
Yeah, I think the intent is that it actually would increase, although Jesse was saying, you know, you could decrease the size to 1 acre. However, the recommendation was to eliminate the criteria 2, which I believe is the underutilized criteria. And then for the location to transit, you would go to a walk shed instead of the current criteria. So it effectively would increase the sites most likely.
Okay, thanks. Let me get to the other folks who have comments. Megan Fluke.
Thank you. So I support the recommendations of the task force members who are in favor of making this more helpful in creating significantly more affordable housing, and for there to be more data that's backing up how the different elements of this policy overlaid over one another impact the range of affordable housing that might be built. We have one number already that the current policy as it stands has built 1 affordable housing development, as I understand it. This is obviously unacceptable and not what we're looking for in the city. So I'm with Linda also that the 1,000 number is fairly unclear. It would be helpful to know how each of the elements of these policies actually create more affordable housing, and then the overlay of each of those policies interact with one another.
Okay.
Also, this is a little bit out of left field, but we're at the beginning of what a post-COVID economy looks like. Now I'm in favor of affordable housing near transit, 100%. However, there are going to be a lot more people who are working from home more often and not needing to drive or get to their office as much. So the 1/2 mile from transit requirement might not make sense anymore. So I'm in favor of this recommendation to council to look at the entirety of this policy again and consider a citywide application with the lens of a greater number of people working from home who are hopefully self-selecting units that don't have loads of parking included. Obviously, we don't want to have, you know, two cars per unit. If we're moving people away from transit, we'd hope that they would self-select because they're not driving as much. And then furthermore, I would hope that the enhanced Office of Race Equity might have something to say about this. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Megan. I've got 3 people left who'd like to make comments: Carl Lee, Bonnie Mace, and then Teresa Alvarado.
So I'm also in support of the motion. And I think the most important part of the motion, as I understand it, is the message we're trying to bring back to council in terms of a broader evaluation of a number of policies within and beyond the scope of what we're responsible for. Absolutely agree with that. And I think I'm going to follow up with a little bit of what Megan was alluding to. I've been on a couple of land use and city planning types of presentations over the last couple of months. in terms of how things are going to go post-COVID or because of COVID. In addition to, I think that with the possibility of people working from home more, from a corporate standpoint and from an individual standpoint. And I don't know where the answers are going to fall because I think the trends are still formulating itself. But I think we as a city need to recognize those things are changing. For example, do we need to have more restaurants and food sources in those type of retail, commercial retail, more so in neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods versus where you see a lot of times in downtown clusters or the commercial development there. The other is, I think the way that the market or community is going to utilize commercial may also be changing, and that may be evolving. Retail may not be what we think of retail historically anymore.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Bonnie?
Yeah, I'm going to support the motion, but with the caveat that, as many people have said, this is a very minimalist change. It's not really, it's a small change in the right direction, but it's not really the change we want. So moving forward, the two comments I'd like to make to council are that we look at a more at the principle of how do we build more affordable housing citywide, as we've all said, and how does that balance against small business displacement? So those are kind of the balancing questions that we need to look at for the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Bonnie. Teresa?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to call the question and ask staff to explain how we're going to do the vote on this. Is it a roll call vote or what's the process?
Well, before we do that, Harvey, you had your hand up. I just saw you added that, and I shared Teresa.
I was hoping to also.
Yeah, and I was going to go back to you, Leslie, to clarify the motion, but Harvey,
I
if
just
you can
wanted
agree,
to say that I am supporting the motion with the caveat that Bob, Michelle, Linda, Bonnie, that whatever changes and tweaks we make, because we do need more affordable housing, and this is clearly deed restricted affordable housing, which was my concern, that we don't kill the golden goose, we don't kill the small business community and their ability to thrive in San Jose.
Thanks, Harvey. Okay, Leslie, I wanted to get back to you to give you a chance to sort of restate the motion and make any change to it in view of the comments that people made.
Sure, I'll try to, because we moved a little bit into the 1.5 acre policy. And I did want to clarify, for many years, we had what we called the 2 acre rule. And there were a number of developments that moved forward under that 2 acre rule. We lost the 2 acre rule when the employment framework was approved by council, and through very, very hard fought work, we were able to get back a 1.5 acre rule. We could not get back the 2 acre rule. We tried very hard to do that. Certainly we would be thrilled to have the 2 acre rule, but I think we're a little afraid to relitigate the whole policy again because it was so hard to get back what we had lost. On a couple of comments, I wanted to just say, I mean, the floodgates are not going to just open. There's not enough affordable housing funding out there to create affordable housing on 1,000 sites or 100 sites. This is just a tool to allow more opportunities for housing, and that's what we need to do right now because it is hard to build affordable housing. There are 100 reasons why it's hard. And what we need to be trying to do is take away some of those reasons and make it easier. And so the more we can take away these barriers, that's what we need to do. And that's why it's really important for us to try to respond to the commercial requirement, which we know is an impediment. Before I mention the motion again, I did want to say that let's say we keep the 1.5 acre rule as it is with the one change that will be part of the motion. We have to deal with that definition of underutilized because that's the reason why we have only had one project come forward. I'm distressed to hear that we're waiting until 2021 to come up with that definition because the conversation has been going on now for a couple of years. And so I would really encourage the staff to speed that up. I'm happy to help with what that could be.
Why don't you make that part of the motion to encourage, we want to encourage the staff to develop clear guidelines and bring a recommendation to the council, setting forth the guidelines on what constitutes underutilized properties.
Okay, so the motion is that we support the staff recommendation to make the change to the 1.5 acre rule to eliminate the commercial requirement, that staff come back looking at the affordable housing that is not included in either the 1.5 acre rule or urban villages, that they look at a fix to that that would deal with the issues that Councilmember Arenas mentioned and other projects that are in the city but don't fall into those two policies. And I'm not being clear on that. Hopefully the staff can figure out a way to state it a little bit better. But to make it so that it actually is looking at the requirement for affordable housing citywide. And then lastly, that as it relates to the 1.5 acre rule, that the staff come back with a definition of underutilized to enable that rule to work, and that they come back more with more speed than early 2021. David said it much more succinctly than I did.
Okay. And maybe just for clarity, as I understand, you're talking about a citywide policy with respect to affordable housing. You want to make sure that there's a uniform policy throughout the city that does not put an obligation on 100% affordable housing developers to develop commercial space.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, so here's how we're, is that okay with the second? That would be you, Linda.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so here's how we're going to do the vote. Teresa was asking about that. We're not going to go through everybody here, all 35 or so of us. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask first, is there anyone in opposition to Leslie's motion? And if you're opposed to the motion, what we want you to do, and right now everybody needs to clear their hand off the participant list. That would be Councilmember Reyes, Bonnie Mace, and Rosalind, you've got your hand up for the moment.
Actually, Chair, I had a clarifying question on the
Sure.
motion for staff purposes. Just wanted to clarify, coming back with the definition of underutilized, is the expectation that staff is coming back to the task force, or is staff including that definition when we submit the recommendations to City Council?
It would be, as I understood it, to the council.
Okay, thanks.
We don't want to hold it.
Yeah, it would be to the council, but when are the recommendations coming back?
Due to our extended schedule now, due to COVID-19, we are looking to take the task force recommendations to council in spring of next year.
So I would say no, that would not be my recommendation. My motion would be that the definition come back much more quickly than that.
Well, hang on, there's two different issues here. We're confusing. I think the thought is March for the 4-year review to go to council. There's the 1.5 acre rule in its entirety, which is going to council on a separate track. Jared, is that, what was the time? Is it the same timeline as the 4-year review? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so we could bring the, we've got some options on that. I think we could advance. So the task force is recommending that with staff to remove the commercial requirements. So, when I mentioned early 2021, my thought there was that we would bring our recommendations on the rest of the criteria as a package with this recommendation tonight, so the council could consider the criteria as a whole. I think Leslie's recommendation is to come back sooner than that to council with a definition for the remainder of the criteria. So we could, that is possible, and that's something we could do
Can I ask a question, Jared? Do you have to come back to the council with a definition of underutilized? That's the policy. I thought that that was a staff decision of how you determined what was underutilized. Or is that something you need council clarification on?
Right.
Because we're just hoping that you get a response so that we know what projects can move forward.
Right.
Right. So we've been directed by council to make this policy more objective and more clear. And so we will be bringing it back because whatever language we propose has to be approved by council or because it's a general plan amendment.
Okay, thank you. And I think there's also state law, right, that requires that.
State laws as well require objective criteria. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, Michael. I think it's clear, Leslie, that your motion wants this brought back before all the other general plan recommendations, so that's understood. So this is how we're going to do the vote. The board's been cleared for everybody's hand. Now, if you're in opposition to the motion, only if you're in opposition to the motion, now's the time to indicate that, and you're going to indicate it by raising your hand on the participant board there. And then if there are any hands, we're going to read those just so we have that as part of the record, because we can't see, not everybody can see what's going on here. So calling the question, is there anyone opposed? Indicate by raising your hand. And I'll give a few more seconds for anybody to do that if they need to. Okay, and staff, do you want to indicate what the vote is? The opposition I'm just seeing is Jesus Flores. Okay, and with that opposition noted, the motion passes. All right, thank you, Leslie. Thank you for everyone on their patience.
Do we want to ask anyone want to abstain?
No, I didn't want to ask anybody that. If we've been here for the duration, you're going to have to take a position. So thank you for doing that. So as I understand it, we're going to wrap this meeting up right now. There's going to be a survey after the meeting. Is that right, Jessica?
That's correct. When you close out Zoom, it's built in. It will pop up another screen for the survey.
Okay, so please, I know it's long. This was a single issue. It was designed to go quicker. It seemed to follow the old rule that no matter how much is on the agenda, we're still going to be here for a couple hours no matter what. But we do want you to complete the survey because we have to figure out how we're going to continue meetings. And this one seemed to work to some level, but meetings can always be improved. So please complete that. And we'll be back in touch as to how we will proceed with our next meeting. I know there's a preference that's been expressed by some people to meet in person. We're just going to have to see whether that's feasible or not. And so Teresa and I will continue to meet with staff and look at the opportunities. Thank you, everyone, for your patience tonight. Thank you for your participation. Everybody stay healthy. Things are they're not getting better out there, so be very careful.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question.
Good job, David.